All right, this lecture is going to talk about Reconstruction, which is typically spanning from 1865 to 1877. And so with Reconstruction, we're really focusing on how we reunite the South with the Union. And there's three different ideas that come from this. We have Lincoln's idea, we have the Radical Republicans' idea, we have Congress's idea, and then after Lincoln's assassination, we have Johnson's idea. So we're really going to be looking at different ideas and then the impact of Reconstruction as we continue on. So the first thing to talk about is right after the war, we have the 13th Amendment that becomes law, and this makes slavery illegal. So that's the first thing that happens. And really the goal of 1865 is, again, restoring these 11 Confederate states back into the United States. So some important issues that will come from this is white Southern loyalty to the United States, and then also repairing the South's economy. And then interesting little fact, this picture over here is showing Lincoln's ghost really upset with a Mississippi congressman, and that Mississippi was the last state to ratify the 13th Amendment. They didn't do so until 1995, so Mississippi is looking real sus. All right, so we have four main questions that we can ask ourselves when we study Reconstruction. The first one being, well, how do we bring the South back to the Union? What does that process look like? What do we do? Do we punish anybody? So looking into that process. The second thing is, how do we rebuild the South after all the destruction during the war? So yes, we have to rebuild their economy, but we also have to rebuild physically because we have Sherman's March to the Sea that really destroyed a lot that was going on in Georgia and a lot that was going on in the South. Number three is we have to look at how do we integrate and protect newly emancipated Black freedmen. So the term freedmen, that's going to be given to former slaves. So we have to look at how are we going to integrate them into free society, and then how do we protect them, especially when it comes to ideas of white supremacy that will continue on into the South. And then the last thing to look at is what branch of government is going to control the Reconstruction process. Is it the sole job of the president? Is it the sole job of Congress? So who's going to lead that process? So looking into some issues of the South, so right off the bat, a fourth of all white Southern men of military age had died during the war, and then another fourth or another quarter of all men had been injured during the war. And so we're down a lot of men, a lot of manpower from there. Another thing is the Southern economy was destroyed. So to finance the war, the South was just reprinting money. And so printing and printing and printing, that causes inflation, which means that their money was essentially worthless. And so we have to figure out how to restore that, figure out how to get the South out of debt. We can also look into the Southern banking system because it was also in chaos right after the Civil War, and that we have large numbers of both Black and white families who are going to be dependent on federal aid. And this could be them coming home from war and having their homes destroyed, having no source of income, but also looking into freedmen, former slaves, and how they're supposed to support themselves when they've been slaves and they've been working for free essentially this whole time. And speaking of slaves, we can also look into slave emancipation, meaning the South had lost over, or would lose, over $2 billion worth of capital. And so we can look and we can understand that the South was in debt, but now that they don't have slaves, we have to look at how are we going to get them out of debt? What other source of income can we use? So first plan that we can look at is Lincoln's plan, his first plan, I should say, his 10% plan. And so Lincoln's going to believe that it is the president's job and not Congress's job to lead Reconstruction. He's going to put everything on him to lead the South in reuniting with the United States. So what he wants to do is he wants to place military governors in the South, and they would be placed there and they would stay there until the Southern governments could come up with a new form of government and essentially a new state constitution. And so Lincoln was ready to pardon white Southerners who would take an oath of allegiance to the Union, which is supposed to be to address the loyalty issue. And so a big part of this is Lincoln saying that 10% of the 1860 electorate must take this oath for the new state government to be established. And so I want to focus in on this 10% of the 1860 electorate. So we're going to use 1860 as a year because that was the last election that the South was a part of. They didn't vote in the 1864 election because they considered themselves to be a different country, and so they couldn't vote in our election. So we go back and we're using these numbers from the election of 1860, and Lincoln says that we need 10% of these numbers to take this oath in order for you to re-enter the Union. Another big thing is that Lincoln himself wouldn't personally recognize the state unless they accept slavery as illegal. So we need 10%, and we also need these states to recognize that slavery can no longer continue. Looking into the Wade Davis bill and how they're going to add on to Lincoln's 10% plan. So in April of 1864, this is even before the Civil War ended, Louisiana is drafting a new constitution that gets over 10% of their electorate to vote in favor of. Lincoln is ready to accept this constitution, but Congress rejects it, and so we have Senators Henry Davis and Benjamin Wade who come in and introduce an extension onto Lincoln's 10% plan. And so with their bill, they decide that we need 50% of people in the Confederate States to take an ironclad oath, which says that they were never voluntarily supporting the rebellion in the first place. So it's kind of like a super oath to Lincoln's oath. Another thing that this added on is that Confederate political officers would be excluded from politics, and so we couldn't have Confederate President Davis come back and take his Secretary of War position that he fulfilled before the Civil War. It's saying if you're involved in Confederate politics, then you're done as far as politics in the United States. And really, the main goal of this bill was to postpone Reconstruction until after the war was over. Lincoln's plan, pretty much from the beginning of war, was thinking, how are we going to restore the South to the Union? Because he wanted to win, and in winning, that's getting the South back into the United States. And so from the beginning, he was really thinking about how this process is going to go, how we can do this, and how we can get the process jump-started. So this bill says, no, we can't really plan anything until the war is officially over. So looking into Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction when the war is over in 1865, his first thing is that he wants gradual support for equal rights and black suffrage. So he does think that the United States needs these two things, equal rights for blacks and their right to vote, but he doesn't think this should be immediate. He understands that it's going to take some time, it's going to be a process to change the minds and the mentalities, especially in the South, as far as equal rights for whites and blacks. Another thing is that Lincoln planned to be lenient to the South in terms of confiscating rebel property and punishing Confederate leaders. We're going to have some Unionists who believe that any rebel should be harshly punished for seceding and for bringing the country into a civil war, but Lincoln isn't really going to see it that way. He wants to be more lenient. Some issues that are going to come with this plan is that executive power alone could not reunite the southern states into the United States. So Lincoln alone does not have this power, and we saw that with Louisiana, and that Lincoln was ready to accept their plan, but Congress rejected it, and so we're going to need some working together. We're going to need Congress to be involved. So the next group we're going to look at in their plan for Reconstruction is the Radical Republicans. The Radical Republicans, a big name that comes up is Charles Sumner, and he's the guy who was beat by the cane when we were talking about Kansas, Nebraska. So he's going to be a big face for the Republicans here. And so they have a fear that the Democratic Party that was really prominent in the South, they were fearful of a takeover because they didn't want any issues. They wanted to remain in power. They wanted to promote equality and black suffrage and get the Union back together and united. And so ways to prevent this from happening was to give ex-slaves or give freedmen the right to vote, and also to limit the rights of former rebels. So specific ways that we can do these two things is number one, punish main rebels by confiscating their land, and number two, giving freedmen the same rights as whites. They also believed that seceded states should revert back to territorial status and that they left the country, and so they're going to have to follow a similar process as territories to gain entrance back in. They also believe that Congress and not the president, so not Lincoln alone, should control the Reconstruction process. So before Lincoln can actually set forth with his plans, he's assassinated. So pretty much a couple of days after the Civil War is ended, on April 14th of 1865, Lincoln is watching a play at the Ford Theater in D.C. when he is shot and killed by Booth, John Wilkes Booth. And so Booth initially escapes, but he's tracked down and killed by Union troops a few days later. Another interesting fact is that 4 others were involved in this assassination. They were tried, found guilty, and also hanged for their crime. And after Lincoln's assassination, we have his vice president, Andrew Johnson, who takes his place and becomes president. So looking into what is Johnson's plan for Reconstruction now that he's president. So essentially, Johnson wants to continue Lincoln's policy. He believes that he as the president should be in charge of the Reconstruction process, And his goal is to really restore the South to the Union before Congress has their meeting in December of 1865. So main thing he wants to do, he wants to be lenient toward the South, just in that if you're more lenient, then you can rejoin the South to the United States faster. If we start talking about punishment, then that's an extension of getting everything back to functioning normally, to functioning how things were almost before the Civil War. So when it comes to freedmen and their right to vote, he's going to believe that this should be a decision that's left up to the states. He himself does not consider blacks to be equal to whites, and he's actually opposed to black suffrage, so he's going to put that all on the states in deciding whether or not blacks should be given the right to vote. Looking further into what did Johnson do, so he's also going to appoint provincial state governors to oversee elections. In these elections, the goal is to come up with a new state constitution in which only whites could vote on whether they agree or disagree to the constitution. And once this was done, then that southern state would be readmitted into the Union. An important thing that's going to come out of this, though, is that we see black codes developing in the southern states. And so with black codes, we have a very early foreshadowing of Jim Crow laws. So it's a separation from whites have this area or this thing, this water fountain to share, and blacks have this thing or this water fountain to share. So it's the early beginning of segregation in the South. Another thing is that we're going to have freedmen become sharecroppers, so they're tenant farmers, again, just going back to similar work that they did as slaves on plantations and working with agriculture. And Johnson, he's going to be concerned for freedmen, but he's going to stay true to his states' rights ideology as far as for developing black codes or his lack of intervening to prevent black codes from happening. And we'll stop there.